Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. The arts education section at the North Carolina Public School or Department of Instruction is very thrilled to have our special guest, James Doherty, here today to talk to you about impacting student success with Title IV. I will be dropping this bit.ly into the chat here shortly if you'd like to follow along with our presentation today. Thank you so much to all of you who waited until 10 a.m. I apologize for any sort of confusion regarding the beginning start time of the session. But we are very excited today to present you all with this information. My name is Brandon Rader, and I am the arts ed consultant for music and theater arts. And we will be bringing on a brand new consultant here, I believe, week after next for visual arts and drama as well, or sorry, for visual arts and dance as well. Today, though, you're going to mostly be hearing from James Doherty. He is the Arts Education and Distance Learning Program Specialist for Davidson County Schools. James Doherty has been a champion for the Every Student Succeeds Act since he became president-elect of the North Carolina Music Educators Association in 2013. Representing North Carolina in Washington, D.C. annually since 2014, he has been an advocacy champion for the inclusion of music and the arts as a part of every child's access to a well-rounded education. Following the signing of ESSA into law in December of 2015 by President Obama, James represented NCMEA at the first external stakeholder meeting for ESSA implementation sponsored by the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction on Friday, June 3rd of 2016 at the North Carolina School Board Association offices in Raleigh. And he has been working since that time to promote the benefits of ESSA legislation to music and arts education stakeholders throughout North Carolina and the nation. Throughout the NCDPI stakeholder meeting, James focused on how Title IV Part A of the new ESSA legislation could be of great benefit to school districts seeking to provide better student access and participation for music and arts courses, but who may have lacked adequate funding. Upon learning of the work of the Title IV Coalition sponsored by the National Association for Music Education, also called NAFME, James became a student of the funding process for the Title IV Part A section of ESSA and asked to be a part of the developing the Title IV implementation in Davidson County Schools. From this point forward, he has shared the DCS Title IV journey with others in an effort to give all students as much access to the possibility of funding opportunities that support music and the arts. So James really knows or is quite the expert in the subject, and we are thrilled to have him with us. Just a few housekeeping notes. All our attendees will be muted throughout the whole session. So if possible, if you could please use the question function in order to write any of your questions. We will stop at multiple times throughout the presentation to answer any of those questions. This session is being recorded and will be emailed to you approximately 1 hour after the end of the meeting, along with a CEU certificate. And the recording will also be housed on the Arts Education Google site, housed by NCDPI, underneath the extended sessions of the Arts Coordinator meeting. So without any further ado, well, let me just answer the first question. I dropped the link to the slides into the chat box. I hope everybody can see it. If not, you will definitely have that information in your email at the conclusion of this webinar. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to James Doherty.
Brandon, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk with everybody today as we practice our new way of doing professional development through platforms like Zoom and GoToMeeting. I told Brandon earlier that I was excited to be doing GoToMeeting today. I put on a tie and I was all ready to go, but then I realized, oh, I don't have to do that because nobody can see anything but the slides, so that's okay. Title IV is something that is really important to me and I'm very passionate about because it's one of the best funding sources for the arts that have come along in years, and certainly since I've been teaching. And what I want to do today is to give you a little bit of history of Title IV. Some of you may have seen some of this in the past, and that's okay. And then I'm going to add a few things to that. I'm going to talk about the process of Title IV and how that may or may not work in your school district. And then we'll have some time at the end to talk about advocacy and how we can promote the continued support of funding for Title IV. So here we go first. We'll talk about how Title IV came about. Back in December of 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act replaced the No Child Left Behind Act, which was all part of the, it used to be under President Johnson when it started, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESSA, and then it's evolved under different congressional leadership groups through the years. But under ESSA, there was a flexible grant program that's called Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants, or SSAEG. And this school year that we're in now, it was authorized for funding nationally at $1.21 billion. And those dollars are divided out across states, depending on the Title I formula. All those titles go together with part of the funding, and they are intended to help support a well-rounded education for children in our public schools and other schools as well, depending on how their funding works. So from the actual legislation, a well-rounded education is defined, and we have a lot to celebrate in the arts because back in 2015, I have it marked in my calendar. This is the first time that music and the arts were ever enumerated in federal legislation as subjects that are important. The exact wording is here. The term well-rounded means courses, activities, and programming, and the subjects such as, and you see that long list on your screen, but notice that music and the arts are listed there, and that's very, very important for us. And as it finishes up, it talks about with the purpose of providing all students access to an enriched curriculum and educational experience. So we are thrilled that for the first time in most of our careers, we are recognized so well in federal legislation. And that's a key to how Title IV is so important. So Title IV was designed by a bipartisan effort, and we don't get a lot of that anymore. So it's real thrilling to know that that happened. And the grant is used to help states and districts serve disadvantaged students by including and providing access to well-rounded education subjects that include music and the arts. In recent years, congressional funding has increased for this title, and that is not something that has happened in any small way or effort, and it's certainly not something that has happened for lack of work. There's been a lot of advocacy that's been put behind making sure the funding for Title IV is there. In fiscal year 18, it was funded at $1.1 billion, and that was a 250% increase from the year before when it only got $400 million. The entire block grant is authorized at $1.6 billion. And the difference in authorized and appropriated is this, to give you a little bit of congressional understanding. Congress, when they passed ESSA, authorized different things at certain amounts of money, but every time they do a budget, they have to appropriate money. So every year you go back and you ask them to appropriate, and if you haven't got the authorized amount of money, you try to get them to get closer to that. So right now we're at $1.21 billion, and we're at a point that we're looking at what's going to happen for next year. So that's important to keep in mind. So this year's funding level provides numerous school districts with flexibility that they need to invest in a well-rounded curriculum, because the decisions that are made about how to use Title IV are left at the local school district. They're not, DPI and the state does not tell school districts how they have to use the money. These decisions are left at the local level. And that's why it's important for us to share with you how this process works so you can be involved or figure out who in your district is making the decisions about Title IV. So under the funding level, Title IV is a formula grant program, and that's how it was intended by law. There was a lot of conversation about it being a competitive grant, but we know that not all school districts have grant writers, or not all school districts have the money to have someone write grants for them. So the formula grant works best, especially for smaller or rural districts who don't have the resources to get grants written for them. And Title IV Part A authorizes funding for activities that fall under three broad areas. The one where arts education falls is the first, which is providing students with a well-rounded education. The other things that happen through that, besides the arts, are college and career, STEM, civics, and international baccalaureate and advanced placement. So when school districts are looking at funding, they can use funding from Title IV for those other areas as well. It also supports safe and healthy students with comprehensive school mental health, drug and violence prevention, training on trauma-informed practices, and health and physical education. Now, I want to talk just a minute, and I'm going to get to this later in the presentation. It's always critical as an advocate for funding that you tie music and the arts into as many of these categories as you can, especially when you're doing a needs assessment. And we're going to hear a lot more, and we've already begun to hear a lot about students and their social and emotional needs and social emotional learning. I think it's important that we make a connection to safe and healthy students and the well-rounded education piece in these two components of Title IV Part A, because they go together. What you'll find if your school district is not using Title IV very much or at all for the arts is there may be districts who have used all this money for mental health or violence prevention. So you'll have to ask questions of your federal programs coordinator, you know, where is the money being used if it's not happening with the arts. And the last place is supporting the effective use of technology that has professional development behind it, blended learning, and ed tech devices. The great thing about the technology piece of this is it's limited and capped about how much can be used. Each state receives an allocation for the flexible block grant based on the school district's Title I formula. So whatever amount of Title I money gets in a school district, that's how a district knows and the Title IV money comes about. There's a great thing about that because that eliminates this competitive targeting, as I mentioned before, where smaller districts might not be able to utilize things like grant writers. Any school district that receives a formula allocation above $30,000 must conduct a needs assessment for Title IV and then must spend 20% of the grant on safe and healthy activities and 20% on well-rounded education. So in other words, if you got $100, you'd have to spend at least 20 of that $100 on well-rounded, that part, that third of it. The remaining 60% of the money could be spent in all three, including technology, but there's a 15% cap on devices, equipment, software, and digital content. So you could have a school district that spent 20% of their money on, or $20 out of that 100 on safe and healthy, and then they put $80 in well-rounded, or they may space it out, and that's a local decision. That's not anything that's guided or directed by DPI. So it's important to have stakeholder involvement at every LEA when you're doing this. So if a district gets less than $30,000, the law doesn't require a needs assessment or a setting aside percentage for well-rounded and safe and healthy students, but the district has to spend the money on activities in at least one of the categories. The 15% cap on technology still is applicable for those districts. This is a graphic from NAFME, the National Association for Music Education, and it kind of summarizes what we've talked about so far about the student support and academic enrichment grants. You'll notice this basically tells you how it works. It's where it's authorized, and it can be used in the three areas: well-rounded education, safe and healthy schools, and technology. We won't give you a test on that, but it's good for you to know and have that information. The amount districts receive is based on what Congress allocates. And so NAFME and the Title IV Coalition urges people to support the work of NAFME and delegates in Washington every June as we go back to Congress and ask them to fully fund it. And For those of you that are involved in a professional organization for any of the arts groups like NAFME, NCMEA, this is where your membership money goes partially to help support getting this funding. Now you'll notice at the very bottom corner, there's an authorized level, there's an allocation from 18 and allocation from 19. You'll notice that it went up just a little bit from 18 to 19. And you'll also notice that in the president's budget request that was released in February, he did not request any funding for this title. The president has not requested funding in any of his budgets so far, and so far that hasn't stopped Congress from allocating funds where they have. So there's always a difference in opinion in Washington, it seems, about how much something like this should receive, but we're very lucky and fortunate that Congress has felt strongly about appropriating this money. And I'll show you some reasons why that may be soon. This graphic is just some things that were highlighted out of allowable use. I certainly don't want to read all this to you, and when you have the slides, you'll be able to go back and look through this and check things out for yourself. School districts use this part of a guiding document to help. We often get questions like, can a district pay a person with this? Can you pay for a program? And the answer to that is, depending on what it is and how you're using it, yes. I like to think that school districts want to put the money in the hands of students as much as possible. Well, not literally in their hands, but in supporting students with what they need. And I think that Congress appreciates that more than anything else that we can do. So at this point, I'll just see if we have any questions so far, Brandon, about the history and the funding part.
We actually are all good. We have no questions.
Okay, great. Well, I hope I'm not boring everybody out there too much, but either I'm going through it really well or really bored, one of the two. Hopefully it's the going through it well. So the next big question is, well, how do we get this money? And a lot of you are probably thinking, I haven't heard of this money, or my district's not using it, or nobody's telling me anything about it. So how you find out is you need to talk to the federal programs coordinator or whoever handles Title I for your school district. Every school district for Title I has to complete something called the Comprehensive Continuous Improvement Plan. And that's the grant program that manages all the titles. It's CCIP. So if you walked into your district office and you said, could you tell me about our CCIP? They're already going to look at you like, wow, you know something that most people have never heard of. So the CCIP application from the Department of Public Instruction is where districts are putting this information. It's a planning and management tool, and that's how they track and monitor what's going on with all the school districts and their federal money. So every school district that receives Title I has to do a needs assessment every year. So if you're a teacher that's viewing this today, or a district level leader or an administrator, you'll know and be familiar that if you work or serve in a Title I school, you do that needs assessment every year, and you're probably familiar with it. Title IV requires a needs assessment once every 3 years. So you don't have to do it all the time like you do Title I, and when I say all the time, I mean annually. But you have to do it so you can determine and identify where you have needs for students. The needs assessment process for Title IV is part of this routine cycle of planning and evaluation that all federal programs have. The great thing about the needs assessment is every district writes their own needs assessment, and they come up with their own questions to ask. So if you know you have a deficiency, you want to write your needs assessment to highlight that so you have evidence and data to support the fact that you don't have what you need. And that's really important to remember. So when you identify the deficiencies, districts create a plan to address the needs, which becomes a part of their funding ask that goes to DPI through the CCIP, the Comprehensive Continuous Improvement Plan. And after receiving funding, then they begin to implement the plan, and then they conduct another assessment for needs assessment every 3 years for Title IV and reevaluate the process. One practice that we have gotten into in Davidson County is we did our large needs assessment early on a couple of years ago, but we've tried to do little smaller needs assessments with targeted groups in the off years so that we have more data to help us write the grant request every year, because you can't simply copy and paste what you did last year into next year. So this needs assessment, what does it look like, and how do you start creating one? And for us in Davidson County, that was the challenge, because when we started Title IV back in 2017, there were no needs assessments for this part of the titles. So we had to figure that out. I have a link that's here. And in this link, it is a copy of the very first Title IV needs assessment that was comprehensive across all three areas: the well-rounded, the safe and healthy students, and technology. And it will force you to make a copy of it in Google, so you will own it and you can go through it and use it or destroy it or whatever you want to do. It won't affect anything because you will be the owner of your own copy. So if you want to know what was in it, you can click there or write that down later. Brandon, if you can maybe put that in the chat box too, in case people, I don't think they can click on the presentation to get it. And we'll have
no problem.
All right, good, thank you. I was trying to give you time to write it down so you could type it in there. And that's a great starting place if you're not already doing one. And this is again from November 2017. So what's unique about Title IV in this process is that you can have many stakeholders who partner with the school district in creating the needs assessment and evaluating the programs. And this is where individual teachers make a difference, because getting involved in making certain the needs of students and programs are fully identified and incorporated as part of the plan is very important. Now, I know it's really hard if you can't find out who in your district is in charge of it, but that's where you have to be persistent but patient until you get to that right person. And you just have to keep saying, I would love to be a part of this. Would you please contact me? Would you let me know how I can help? And eventually, if you keep knocking on the door, you'll get your foot in, and then that's how we start making a difference when you're at the table to help with the process. But again, it is up to every school district, so there's not a lot that DPI or the state can do when it comes down to the money in your district. So as this process about the needs assessment works and how you put it into CCIP, you have to assess for what you need. You have to plan how you're going to address those needs. For example, if you assess that you don't have enough tubas for your band programs in your school district, how are you going to address this need? Then you apply through the funding in CCIP. You implement the changes, which basically would mean you purchase the tubas and you talk about the impact that purchase has had. And then you evaluate at the end of the year to see if you met the needs, or do you need to make changes, or do you move on to something else. So it's a whole continuous cycle. And I probably should have had a nice circle graph or something there, but I wanted to give you the information so that you have that prepared. The most important thing here, and I know there's some folks from Davidson County Schools that are on this webinar, is if you do things as you go along with Title IV, your work at the end is very easy. For example, in Davidson County, I asked all of our arts education teachers to take one moment in a spreadsheet and talk about how they use their funding. And I have all that collected. And so now when I need to talk about the evaluation piece, I've got all this testimony from teachers that all I've got to do is cut and paste to go into the CCIP program. It's very important that you collect that information and save it for later. As you're working in CCIP, you've got to be able to think and write, because there's a lot of hows and what you're going to do. So when you apply in CCIP, you've got to have a good description of what's going on, how the funds are going to be used, how they're going to support well-rounded, safe and healthy, and technology, and then how you're going to evaluate. And that's also a big thing too, because if you don't talk about how you're going to evaluate using the money, it's a lot harder to keep getting it. So you got to have a plan. And that can be simple. It can be, if you have professional development, surveying the stakeholders about that. It could be feedback from students. It could be surveys. It could be a number of things it could be. So in November 2017, when we did that first needs assessment, we had a stakeholder group of all these folks that are listed. You'll notice that they're not all arts, and they cover a lot of areas, but we had representatives to cover every area of Title IV. Again, the well-rounded, safe and healthy, and technology. Plus there's parents. We had a parent, a student representative, and a faith-based community member as well. There were not like hundreds of people, but this is probably about 15 or 20 people there that were met. And what we did at that meeting is we went through the needs assessment we had created. We took time to see if we needed to adjust any questions to make sure we would get good data. And then after that, we administered the needs assessment. So tweaking that with this group was really important as well. If you copied the needs assessment before, this is some screenshots of what you would have gotten. We had 3 big sections, the one on well-rounded, safe and healthy schools, and technology. And I designed this because I didn't have any other idea about how to do it. I used a Likert scale because I wanted to show percentages of how people strongly agree or disagree. If I had to do this first one again, I would probably go with 5 instead of 7 points on the Likert scale, but I was trying to be able to differentiate because we all know that sometimes if that window's too small, you know, you put it in the middle, you're kind of wishy-washy in the middle about it. So we wanted to give room for people to say, I don't strongly agree with it, but it's more than the middle and that kind of thing. So that would be a recommendation for me looking back. This is an example of something we did April a year ago, and this was targeted to secondary teachers, and it was targeted to secondary visual art, music, and theater teachers. So this is an off year, but it was an additional needs assessment, and we wanted to tie this in a little bit to PBIS and MTSS, which has to do with the safe and healthy schools. So that was important for us to get some more data there. Now, under the next 3 screens, and I don't want to read all these screens to you, these are some of the questions that we had, and in bold at the end of the question, it just talks about the percentage of how much people agreed or disagreed. So I just took that 7-point Likert scale, and if 80% of the people were agreeing, then I put the number there. And this is great data because if you'll look at the 3rd bullet, schools are easily able to provide adequate numbers of instruments and art supplies for students who desire to participate in music and art. 100% of the respondents to our needs assessment disagreed. Well, that is a strong message that you need to put some funding about instruments and art supplies in order for your programs to be successful. Then we had a scheduling question there because that was a concern at that time. There was a planning concern from elementary teachers. So in other words, we were taking things that were concerns that we knew were issues in the district and trying to put them in the needs assessment so that the funding streams would support the work that we wanted to do. So the next set was under safe and healthy schools. You'll notice that first bullet talked about school staff address the social and emotional needs of students. I guarantee you, if you went back and talked about that now, even in our district, that would be much different in the percentages. And you'll notice that one I broke down between neutral, agree, and disagree. So things change over time, and that's important to know. You'll notice down in equipment, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th bullet, physical education equipment is maintained in good repair. 100% of respondents disagree. That we were replacing worn and outdated PE equipment, 100% disagreed. So, again, great data from that. And finally, on the technology, we tried to put some questions in here that addressed concerns for music and other areas, but like the music question was every room where music is taught has equipment that has technology for making recordings and listening. And most people disagree because we typically don't have the best equipment for recording in our classrooms. And so that's something we know we need to work on. It has not gotten to the point of importance that I'd like it to, but you got to work on that the best you can in every school district to make sure that your funding is covering everything that you need to have covered. Somebody asked me where these questions came from. The music-specific questions came largely from the Opportunity to Learn standards that are published by NAFME, and I'm sure other subject areas have some national standards. And quality descriptors about what classrooms for visual art, theater, dance would have that would make them great classrooms. So you can adapt those for your needs assessment as well. And moving into the next section, in May of 2018, when we did a little mini survey, we asked teachers what they would like to see as a focus on improving, and we gave them some choices between professional development and technology. And so you can see that we got graph support there. The number one, improving opportunities for students with the purchase of additional school-owned instruments. That was for music. And for visual art, it was providing opportunities for students with more consumable art supplies, because we know how expensive they are and how little money we get. So we had great data to show, and this was all done as a Google form, but it's great to have this to upload. And finally, we had some for theater. The theater teachers talked about improvements to rehearsal space, and a couple of notes in that one. The secondary arts teachers surveyed indicated that their school is not easily able to provide adequate supplies, which I'm sure is no surprise to anybody on this webinar, and that over 60% said that students in their school who did not participate in art, music, theater, it was because they had difficulty purchasing those things. Again, you're just building the case about why you need the funding. And 90% said that respondents say data from their school would show that a majority of students who are involved in arts education courses are more engaged. And that's important to ask those kind of questions, because it's one thing for us to say, well, we know that kids that are involved in the arts are better students. Well, where'd you get that data? And if it's 10 years old or you didn't do it locally, it doesn't mean as much. But if 90% of your people say, yeah, that's a big difference in our schools, that's important. So, Brandon, do we have any questions at this point that so far about the needs assessment?
No, we don't. And I do want to point out that I did drop that bit.ly link as well in the chat for the sample needs assessment, but no questions so far.
Okay,
great. Oh, wait, hold on. So this was, I'm going to take Jasmine's question and turn it into a slightly different question that I was thinking of as well. Many of our attendees are teachers, so they are not at the district level. How do teachers actually get the access to participating or helping formulate this needs assessment, and when should that happen?
That's a great question, and I didn't talk about time, so Jasmine or whoever asked that, that's a great point. So first, I know as a teacher, you often feel like you don't have any power or ability to do anything about the funding. The way that I always encourage people to do this is, if you ask your principal, they may or may not know either, because a lot of times the administrators at the school level are just given budgets and funding, and they don't really have a part of the process of planning. You really have to seek out the person that does the federal programs coordinator at the school district level. Some districts that's on the website and it's easy to find, and others it's not. And there's some school districts where that person wears multiple hats. In Davidson County, our director of elementary education is also the federal programs coordinator. So when you figure out who does that, just send them an email and say, hey, I am Brandon Rader. I teach at such and such school. I've recently learned more about Title IV funding, and I'd really like to be a part of helping with our needs assessment and helping guide the path of how we're using the funding. Can I be a part of this, and could I help you in any way? And you just open that door in a positive way. And if you don't get a response, or you get a we're okay, then you just keep asking. But as far as the timeline goes, school districts start doing needs assessments in April and May, and the CCIP information has to be uploaded sometime in June. So in order to get money in the next school year, you have to get all this needs assessment and information in CCIP by June. I won't say it's the 30th. I think it changes depending on who's doing it every year. But basically, by the end of the school year, you have to have already done the work to apply for money for the next year. That's a great question. All right. So back kind of in talking about that narrative, as you're writing this in CCIP, you've got to talk about the how. And I've got an example of what we wrote, that we wanted to improve the quality of instruction, and we would have a more effective supported course of studies. Again, I don't want to read all that to you, but that had to do with the elementary level. And then how would we evaluate that? So the teachers would be surveyed on the effectiveness of professional development, because we put that there would be professional development in there as far as the planning and prep time goes. And like in our school system, the teachers in elementary have been able to have planning days because of Title IV. Then another how, we want to increase access for materials and arts education courses by offering support. So that's your how, what you want to do. And then the evaluate, the increase in materials will allow students and teachers to broaden the scope and sequence of their instruction. And that's kind of wordy, but in other words, you know, one of our elementary teachers said, oh, well, now that I have this additional funding, we can do work with clay. We can do work with ceramics, or something that they would not ordinarily be able to do because of they didn't have enough money to do that. So we said that we would use samples of student work products, maybe even Twitter posts or Facebook posts from the teachers that demonstrate how the students, testimonies from the students and testimony from the teachers as well as part of the evaluation. And technology, how we would evaluate that, you know, you can do it through a survey, or just show at one point you had a need for this many, and then at the next point you had a need for less. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It's just the writing of the how and then how you're going to evaluate. So that's two important things to put together. And this is all speaking to what you have to write in CCIP. Now, it may not be that any classroom teacher would ever have to write this, but if you understand what has to happen and you kind of had in the back of your head what would work, if you sent this to your federal programs coordinator, I'm sure they would all love you if you already had a narrative about what you need and how you're going to do it. That helps them a bunch. So when you're thinking about a needs assessment in long term, you're really thinking about different categories and different ways that funding can be used. There's a couple of things I don't have, or one thing in particular, I don't have anything in the boxes yet. But so if you identify that in curriculum, there's a lack of dedicated professional development, or you say that Title IV could be supportive of that. Or in staffing, if you don't have equal instructional minutes between the elementary classes, then maybe you need an additional teacher. And could Title IV Part A address that? So that's over under funding source. So the second column is the immediate impact on outcomes. And that's talking about things like equity and access and inclusion that would fall in there. If you don't do anything, how it impacts. Then like on the bottom, the facilities, lack of acoustical buffers in 2 of the 4 high school instrumental programs. It impacts the quality of sound, also impacts hearing. That ought to be there too. A long-term resource or solution would be to get funds locally, but then if there was a facilities fund partnered with that from Title IV, that would work. So this is an idea about how you can plan out long periods of time about how to use Title IV. Recent surveys from NAFME have found there's 4 basic themes that Title IV is being used for. School districts across the country are using Title IV to create better equity for teacher growth, for student growth, and for the school community. So there's some examples here that I thought are great that you could use when you're thinking through the lens of how could we use this funding in our school district. Increasing participation is great, especially addressing equity. It's also going to be important when you tie the equity piece with student growth. And you'll notice that third bullet under student growth, helping students develop socially, emotionally, artistically, and academically. So there's some state examples of programs that have been funded with Title IV. There's a link here, and Brandon, I'll encourage you if you want to put that link in the chat box as well. These are testimonies from, thank you, sir. These are testimonies from this year from our teachers who shared how Title IV has benefited them. And this is a multi-page document And not only will this work and help be evidence for our CCIP upload, I'm planning to take this with me to Washington, D.C. in June. And I'm going to share this with our North Carolina legislators about, I want you to see the testimony of teachers from my school district about how this money has impacted them. And legislators listen to a lot of different people come in their offices, but when you talk to them about how money that's billions of dollars got a new set of art supplies for Sally in such and such elementary school, or how Jerry has a new bass clarinet to play that he's not having to share with somebody else because it's unhealthy, then you're really making an impact, because they can see those dollars have impacted very well, and that's what we want to do. So that's just some samples of information. If you hear a little bit of growling in the background, it's not my stomach, it's my puppy who's playing with a ball, so I apologize. We'll get him going in just a minute. The joys of teaching and doing things from home. So here's some samples from other states that have used Title IV Part A. And when we talk about things like musical equipment, you can see some examples from different states like Alabama. They talked about using it for musical instruments, supplies, and sheet music. Connecticut talked about buying tubas in an elementary program and having free lessons for kids. Thought that was a great outcome. In Florida, there's a school district that purchased equipment and instruments for band. I don't want anybody to think that we're only buying supplies and equipment, but that seems to be one of the strongest things that districts need, and we know how expensive a lot of that is. I believe one of our school districts in North Carolina, in one of the first years, actually started a string program, one of the counties out east, with Title IV money. Under professional development in Arizona, they have used Title IV money to help teachers in arts integration to language arts and math. And in New York and Rochester, in the schools there, they talked about culturally relevant curriculum writing, also using it for instruments and equipment. And due to the funding, students were getting culturally relevant instruction in the arts that includes additional elective opportunities. So that was great from there. There are events that Title IV has funded. In Delaware, they had a district choral festival. This is an in-school event where all the choirs were bused to one of the schools to perform. In Davidson County, our folks have started something called Real Men Sing, where they have a guest conductor come in, and they have middle school boys in 8th grade with high school boys for a day workshop, bringing them together, because we know that one of the things that's a challenge is boys don't always want to continue to participate in choir from middle to high school. So it's to kind of say, hey, it's okay and it's cool to make music and continue to sing in high school. So that's worked well for us. You'll notice the New Jersey example there. And then in Georgia, their Department of Education designated $250,000 from their Title IV to do 10 competitive grants for rural districts where little arts education was taking place. And then they talked about some other things that they could use it for. Our state has not done any competitive grants with the money that North Carolina has gotten. That's one interesting idea for helping to support rural education and creating better equity and access. So that's a thought behind it too. So last fall, Brandon did a poll on one of our meetings with the arts ed coordinators. And Brandon's poll, you probably remember this, Brandon, was, are you already using Title IV to support arts programs? And look, that 47% of those that were in that meeting said no, or 24 said they had no idea. So that's almost 3/4 of the arts coordinators that were at that particular meeting, no or no idea. So you can see that this is important, that we continue to make sure that we are informing and educating everybody we can about Title IV, because in every school district, somebody's making decisions about this money. Because if you get Title I money, Title IV is there with it. And just knowing where it is really important. And so there's some other ideas from other districts and states. The Pennsylvania music educators are doing a great job there. They're working closely with their Department of Ed and their state ESSA plan. and they are doing a great job in communicating their efforts through their website and through their leadership. And I have a link there. Sorry, Brandon, give you another link to put in the chat box. If you type that link into your browser, you'll be able to go to the Pennsylvania MEA, and you can get a lot of examples of advocacy from there. So our friends in Pennsylvania have offered to share that. You just let me know when you've got that, Brandon.
Yep, we've got it.
Okay, good. And they have a Title IV toolkit, and they've got examples that I've put in the link here or in the little box that popped up. They have success stories. They have a PowerPoint about showing administrators the value of using Title IV. So a lot of great things there. And then how to use Title IV for your music program. Of course, you can substitute art, theater, or dance if you are coming from that perspective. This is a screenshot of an advocacy bulletin from NAFME that was on February 24th. Again, I don't want to have a negative mindset, but it does talk about how the president had released his budget and he did not support funding for Title IV. So that's why it's so important to advocate and let folks know, if you're getting this funding, how important it is. Now, the Department of Public Instruction doesn't do advocacy work, but that's where you as a teacher, if you're involved in an association that does advocacy work, where you can be involved on that side of things from your professional organization. So I wanted to show you a little bit about funding. You'll notice that the requests or what's enacted here and how this has grown from the different titles and different amounts of money. So for fiscal year 20, again, it was 1.21 billion, and we're hoping to get even at least that, if not more. Now, of course, in February, that was before the COVID-19 pandemic had hit, and that's going to create a lot of interesting scenarios. But we can't worry about that now. We've just got to continue to keep our hat on and keep focused on getting us funded at that 1.6 billion authorization level. So what more can you do to support? When you get the slide deck, if you click on the blue advocacy, it will take you to the Grassroots Advocacy Center, Action Center for NAFME. And there's lots of great information there about what you can do to be an advocate for Title IV funding and support the Title IV Coalition. That's important work that we can all be a part of, even if it's as simple as writing a member of Congress, a federal congressional member, not state, and telling them how important it is to you in your classroom that this funding remain available. And again, what more can we do? We can continue to focus on appropriate and full funding for well-rounded programs in ESSA, including Title IV, 1, and 2, because there is money that can be used for music and the arts out of Title I and Title II, but we've been focusing on Title IV today. And so we need to prioritize our needs. We need to make sure that we focus on how we're addressing issues of equity and access. That's often at the heart of Congress's intent for these funds, to help more students gain access to subjects like music and the arts. And if you need materials, then that means more kids get their hands on participating because they get an instrument, because they get art supplies, because they have the things they need to create a theater set. Then you're addressing that equity and access piece. Also, Brandon may speak to this as we end the presentation a little bit more, but you want to consider the connection that music and the arts have to social and emotional learning. And how could you lever a partnership with your MTSS team at school through the arts curriculum and make sure that you're tying those pieces together? And finally, think about ways to fund other needs that come to the top of the needs assessment. Maybe you don't have an all-county chorus or band, or maybe you don't have a district art show or something like that that you want to highlight. And with regard to social and emotional learning, the link here is a link to a new brochure from NAFME about social and emotional learning that you can click on from the slide deck. There's 3 domains in SEL. There's self, others, and responsible decision making. All this information is taken from CASEL, and CASEL is the organization that's really the driving factor in social and emotional learning now. But these 3 bullets from the brochure are really important. thinking about how music and the arts educators are well suited to help students develop socially and emotionally. What does the research tell us? And how can public policy support music and arts education and social and emotional learning? And I think as we go through the end of this year, we know that our students are going to need tons of social and emotional support as they transition back to school. And we know that they're going to need all kinds of support as they just get back to some kind of normal, even if it's not where we were. And being advocates for what we do in the arts, we already support, and we know that we support the social and emotional learning of students. We just have to be ready to make sure that our leaders and administrators understand that, and so we make these connections to keep the funding working well for us. That's all that I have from this point, but I wanted to make sure that we were respectful of your time and we left time to answer any more questions that you might have. And on this last slide, there's a link again to the slides, and at the very bottom, there's an article that appeared about our Title IV journey in Davidson County Schools, and some more things from NCMEA, and an article that Jasmine A. Sutton wrote in our journal when she was president. So Brandon, we'll take it away and see if we do have any more questions.
All right, if anybody has any last lingering questions, if you could please type them into the questions section. I'd be happy to facilitate those. But in the meantime, I did drop those last links about the Pennsylvania MEA and the NAFME advocacy, the SEL brochure, and then also those CASEL core competencies that James had mentioned on social and emotional learning. The national conversation just keeps turning to these core competencies, and as James said, we are already positioned to do them so well as arts educators. So beginning to put in our brains that that's the way we're going to talk about what we do might give us a leg up on meeting the same sort of language that our administrators are planning to use. So.
Brendan, I did see one question from Danny Daly about would I be willing to share the off-year surveys? Absolutely. If you just want to email me, I only have a couple of them because we've only done a few, but I'm more than happy to do that. I can get them to you some way if you just email me.
Wonderful. So all of the links are in the slide deck, and the slide deck link will definitely be in the email that goes out, along with the recording of the session. And this whole presentation will be housed on the DPI website underneath Arts Coordinators and Leaders Extended Sessions. So they will all be present, I promise. We've got a couple questions, James. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just want to share with the group that I appreciate your time today. I know that we've got a lot going on in our lives, and I am not an expert, but I try to be a student of this federal funding and a student of how advocating for the funding benefits students and teachers in our schools. And that's what's important to me. So all I want to do is pass along anything I have learned. And then if I figure out something I don't know well, I'll share that too.
So James, you've done an amazing job sharing with us how to inform the district of the needs of the teachers. So most of the rest of the questions have to do with the dissemination of money. So once a district gets money under Title IV, how do they make the decisions, or who makes the decisions to get it into teachers' hands?
That's done at the local level, and that's where your federal programs coordinator comes in, because in CCIP, they have to develop a budget. So continuing to stay involved with the federal programs coordinator is critical. Now, I imagine in some school districts that the upper level leadership between the superintendent or the finance officer may have some conversations about that. You know, it's probably not likely in any school district that a teacher is going to be able to walk up and say, hey, I want you to put 40% of the Title IV money in blah, blah. You know, that's not likely. And keep in mind that if your district has a short budget, there's probably a lot of things they're going to try to cover if they can out of Title IV, like AP things, student violence and prevention, technology needs. Don't be surprised if next year that in Title IV we see a shift to some of that for remote learning because of the technology piece that's in there. We are very lucky, and I do want to share this with everybody that's listening, that there was a thought process as Congress was working through all these COVID relief packages that they would do away with the titles and just allocate this money kind of as a free for all, I think. But that did not happen, and we're very lucky that the titles remained. Now we may see, you know, a relaxation from the federal Department of Education about how the money has to be spent for a year or so. But even if that happens, we just must remain diligent on trying to keep the focus on using the money as Congress originally intended once we get back to more of a normal state of things.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think that answers any of the last questions. So I hear you, James, say that once you get involved, and once you get involved, stay involved.
That's right. You can't let up. And if you don't get in that first time, you just keep asking and keep, you know, you be like my little puppy who wants to eat my food. He puts his paws up and just keeps looking at me with those eyes like, let me have part of that too.
That's awesome. Well, thank you very much, James, for sharing your knowledge and your time with us today. We really appreciate it. James is an amazing resource and has been a state leader in this for a long time. So he is quite the expert. Do take advantage of the fact that he has been gracious enough to list his email there, and send him an email if you have any further questions. At this time, you are welcome to go ahead and log off. As I mentioned earlier, you will receive an email in roughly 1 hour with a link to your CEU certificate. I will make sure that the link to the presentation slides is there, and you should also receive a recording of this presentation as well. Thank you so much, and have an excellent rest of your day.